We are ready to start. So thank you. Jim, this is an incredible presentation today. I think that many of us haven't heard some of these facts. It was great to hear the organ and to see pictures of these people who are involved, and I think your presentation was just spot on. This presentation you mentioned was originally given 10 years ago at an OHS convention here in Pittsburgh, and very interesting that we have so many people in Pittsburgh with connections to this organ. In fact, we have Ann Labounsky, who played a recital here on the organ, and I'm going to put her program up on the screen so that you can see this marvelous program that she presented in 1969. Ann, would you tell us a little bit about your experience playing that program?
Yes, we had moved to Pittsburgh from New York in 1967, and then they invited me to play there on November 23rd. And it really, finally, as I look back on it, it was really a big program. One of the things that I remember, these Sunday afternoon concerts, many people would just kind of come in and out. They'd be around the area and they would come in. And there was an usher who was standing in the front to the left of the stage with a great big board with numbers on it. And so you can see in the program 1, 2. So when I would be finished with the first, César Franck, Grand Pièce Symphonique, that takes almost half an hour. Then the usher came up, took off number 1 and put up number 2. So people who came in late would realize, okay, well, we're on the second program, the second number on the program. What I remember was it was a very noble sound. There were stops that didn't work, and you had to work your way around so that you could get a good sound finally, but I was able to do that. And it's like so many organs, that have some stops that aren't working. You learn how to work around those. And it was a wonderful sound and a wonderful place to play. There was another large organ like that. Jim Stark was talking about, the toy counter. The organ that I remember at Longwood Gardens had even a bigger toy counter. And that, was also in that residence of the DuPont estate. So it was wonderful to play on this organ. And you explained to us that there was a grand piano that was playable. Well, I don't know if that was playable in 1969 or not, but it was a wonderful, I really enjoyed playing there, and it was a beautiful sound. When I looked at all the programs that were played in the decade of the 70s, I was struck to notice that only 2 of the people who played during that decade are still living. One of them was a former student of mine, Harry Campbell, and the other, you all remember, Gretchen Franz. So I talked to both of those people yesterday just to try to get their impressions of what it was like to play. And Harry, this is what Harry said. He played in January of 1979, and he happened to play on Super Bowl Sunday. That's always a mistake. I remember I played a recital at Church of the Ascension on that day, and then I heard all these car horns just so loud. And I thought, what's going on? Well, that was the time that they won the Super Bowl, and everybody was just celebrating. So anyway, Harry Campbell had met Paul Koch at a wedding. He had been the organist at the Crossroads Presbyterian Church in Monroeville the summer before, and I helped him prepare that program. And there again, I was very impressed with how beautiful it sounded. Only of the principals that were on that organ, Harry told me, only one of them was working at that time, but it was still a very complete instrument. When I spoke to Gretchen Franz yesterday, she told me something very interesting I didn't know. When she was in high school, she had studied with Marshall Bidwell. Now, you had mentioned Marshall Bidwell in your presentation. when she was in high school. She didn't remember anything about playing that recital. But so those are the two people who are still living who had played that. Of course, you can all talk to our dear friend J.R. Daniels, who played it probably the most recently, and maybe he was the last one to play it before you would blow out all the fuses in the library and the other parts of the building. You know, I was also on the committee for the AGO. George Tutwiler was on it too, and other people, probably Barbara McKelway. We were trying very hard to get funding for this organ because it is really a monument. And we had done a lot of work on the organ, the history and what needed to be done. And I think that we had brought in the woman from Barbara Owen, from Boston, to give us her ideas on it. So anyway, and then Jim, I think, were you not the one that was going to go to the Carnegie and speak to them? And at the day you were going to go, the woman who was running it left?
I'm sorry, what was that, Dan?
I remember you're telling us that you were so excited to try to get this thing going, to find a donor to renovate this organ. And you had an appointment.
Yes, that's an interesting story to some extent. I'm not sure how much of this should be public, but I actually got, what was it, Parker, Joe Ellen, I think her name was, the previous president of the Carnegie. And I got her somewhat excited about the idea, and she invited me to come and have coffee. And I have no idea what the politics were, but it was her last day, and the appointment got canceled.
I remember you're telling us that and how disappointed you were.
That's the end of that story.
So there really was no proposal in writing, correct?
I think that there was.
Oh, no. I mean, I'm privy to some non-public information, so I'm not going to be too specific. But it is in writing. It's public that Nelson Barden had made a proposal to restore the organ, and it was in excess of $1 million. That's all the published said. Actually, it was probably about $1.5 million. But at that time, as far as I know, Barbara Owen from Boston, Jack Beathard's Schoenstein Organ Company, San Francisco, was involved, and there were a few other people. So there was a serious proposal made, and the trustees did consider it. But and actually, one of my friends has told me that he actually had a donor, but nonetheless, the trustees turned it down. They wanted to spend the money on other things. And
well, somebody's asking, what do you think it would cost, like in terms of today's dollars, to restore this instrument?
Based on what I have learned from 1990, where I think $1.5 million was probably the operative figure, that's $3 million today. And I will back that up by East Liberty Presbyterian rebuilt a similar size organ, about 6 ranks smaller, for $1.5 million 15 years ago. So that's approaching $2 million. So I think we can talk about the $2 to $3 million range for complete restoration. Now, the thing about it, the problem with that organ is, as I understand it, I've never been inside of it, but in talking to people who have, is that access is extraordinarily difficult. So a phased restoration is almost out of the question. You have to take the whole thing out and start over again. But that's when, Hill Auditorium, and that's a 27 Skinner in University of Michigan, that's been restored. Sambal, obviously in Youngstown, 1926 Skinner, marvelously restored by A. Thompson Allen. So there are things that could be done. And if I may, while I'm on here, let me just make my pitch. I might as well. from a business standpoint, Pittsburgh now, our major industries are meds and eds. This is probably the 4th or 5th largest concert hall organ in the country. And we have 2 prominent music schools who prepare performing musicians. And to have a working large concert hall organ, I think would be a drawing card for Pittsburgh. So, and as I've said, you know, I'm a Baccarat Holtkamp man myself, but nonetheless, I have fond memories of this organ. I think it could have been Skinner's best organ. So I think there should be some effort made. But that's my pick.
Thank you. I appreciate that so much, Jim. I wanted to mention that there is another Farron and Vody organ in Pittsburgh, which was put in about the same time as this organ, and that is at the Calvary Methodist Church on the north side. This is the church that has a very beautiful stained glass windows. It was the church of the Joseph Horn family, and there's a very nice guy, I can't remember his name, who's the organist there, and he's tried to do a lot to try to restore it. I did play that organ, and it's wonderful, the sounds on it. Did you ever play that organ, Jim?
Did I? No.
Have any of you?
Remember, I don't play, but I know it very well. And Brian Burns, who's there, has actually reversed some of the teller's cant changes, and it's closer to what it was originally. And I remember that when I brought my friend Jim Hammond there to play it, somebody asked, you know, if we restored this, who would play it? And Jim said, I would.
Yes.
And he's recorded on Farron and Vody's. But remember, this is a Skinner. 1917, Skinner basically redid the entire organ. So we're really talking about E.M. Skinner here. But the Farron and Vody at Calvary, it's a marvelous instrument, and everybody should go hear it.
Yes.
I recommend it.
You know, I had the opportunity to walk through the organ last week, and I wanted to report to our guild that you know, the organ doesn't seem to be in very good shape. In fact, Jim, you mentioned access to the chambers. They have been there are all kinds of wires running through them from the new sound system and lighting controls that are now installed on the stage. And I saw some pipes piled up, you know, obviously removed from the chests. My question would be, can you tell us a little bit more about these percussions? Because I didn't see anything, and I heard that there was an octave of tuned timpani. Would that have been part of those percussions that were installed in the organ?
Yes. My understanding is there's a tuned timpani, which is very unusual, but nonetheless, it's there. These are the percussions that came from H.J. Hines, but they're Skinner percussions, and Skinner made very few percussion stops, and so they're very special historically. But the problem with percussions, I remember when we were working on the Heartwood organ, it has a yeah, what do they call it? A harp, which is actually a xylophone, but nonetheless they call it a harp. And I talked to Mike Foley, and Foley Baker had, you know, they've restored a number of organs, and Mike said it is the most complicated organ mechanism that he had ever worked on. And that's the problem with restoring the percussions. It's extraordinarily expensive. And the harp at Heartwood, we had within our budget, we had no hope of ever restoring it. We would have to have Lalcuff, you know, build new parts for us. And that's the problem you get into in restoration. But nonetheless, this is a very special instrument. So
very interesting. Somebody asked about the pedal board. One of your pictures showed a flat pedal board, and then all of a sudden we saw the American Guild of Organists concave and radiating. Did that come with a new console?
Well, I'm assuming, I'm a shot from the hip a little bit on this. I'm assuming in 1903, when Vody put in a new console, he put in a concave pedal board, because I know at Aeolian later, when he was there, he used concave pedal boards. Concave radiating was not quite in, but concave was at that time. So he probably put it in, and the organists, of course, obviously liked that better.
Absolutely. Question about why were E.M. Skinner's changes in 1907 considered so radical? Is that the time that the wind pressure was increased?
No, what I said about that, and the reason I thought it was radical, because, and somebody actually asked a question about my spreadsheet. Spreadsheet, I used the abbreviation TB, which meant toe board. So what he had done was he put an 8-foot rank on the mixture toe board, for instance. But what he had done was to replace a lot of the upper work with 8-foot ranks. And of course, he also added the diapason and the tromba on 10-inch wind, which was very unusual for that period. So in a way, it was a radical, but it may have been the prelude to the 1917 rebuild, a complete new organ. He put in, actually, there was 1 or 2 new chests that he added, but in 17, all the chests were replaced.
Oh, okay. Going back to the beginning of your presentation, you showed us sketches of the original Carnegie complex, and then all of a sudden they were greatly enlarged. Did that, what was the organ and the music hall consider that important that they would enlarge that section of the building to be so prominent? Frank, have you seen anything about that?
No, actually, no changes were made in the music hall. And not till 1910 did Heinroth make some changes in the organ. The building itself, though, was substantially enlarged, and Carnegie, of course, was still alive at that time. He took a great interest in this building. So this was the library was incidental to this, actually. The museum was the big part of the building, and the big expansion was the museum. So we ended up with the main part of the museum that we now know, the dinosaur room and all that stuff, and plus the music hall foyer, which was added on at that time. But the music hall remained unchanged.
Right. He altered the Carnegie specifically, didn't like the appearance of the original music hall from the exterior, from the Forbes Avenue entrance, with these 2 Venetian type towers like St. Mark's in Venice, which he referred to as donkey ears. So it was the exterior that was altered, not the interior.
So the grand hall that precedes the music hall, was that original?
No, that was the 1907 edition, and that's undoubtedly Harlow's design. And it's more in the style, actually, of Sanford White, if you get into that kind of nerdy sort of thing.
So originally there was a much more humble vestibule or some gathering space.
Yes, actually, when you walk into the music hall, the circular part, when you go through the foyer, you walk into a circular, a semicircular hallway. That was the original entrance to the music hall.
Oh.
So the whole foyer was not there.
Question also, somebody asked about the organ shop that used to be under the front steps, I believe, or somewhere in that area. And I think, was it Organ Craft or somebody had a shop there? Anyway, I
don't know, and Frank might know. I have no idea.
That's news to me.
Yeah, it's the door's still there. In fact, when I went last week, it appears that there was some security personnel down there. So I think they've repurposed that space or whatever it was. I actually got to walk through the entire instrument, which was very interesting because the console, I got to see the back of the console and the mechanism to raise it, which is quite complex. And I was kind of surprised that the console was sort of counterbalanced with this huge weight. So I can only imagine what it took to raise that console.
Yes, and back in the good old days, when Marshall Bidwell was playing, the console would begin to rock back and forth.
Oh, I mean, we always hear stories of organists who are playing consoles that are on lifts, maybe even above the stage, and then the mechanism doesn't work, and the poor organist has to retreat by means of a ladder or something like that. But I don't think that was ever the case here in the Carnegie Hall organ, because the organ essentially was lifted to stage level, excuse me. And below the stage, I did get to see where the blower was kept. It's the largest blower I've ever seen, but just one. Huge. Sacred Heart has a very large blower, but this was even larger than that. And I do recall that the space was kind of crowded. So obviously, since they're not using the organ, they're storing things in the blower room, and some of the other mechanism rooms that are below the stage are no longer just for the organ. It's very interesting to climb to the back of the stage, the proscenium, to walk above the proscenium, and there are organ chambers up there.
Mm-hmm.
So the chambers really go all the way from below the stage to above the proscenium. Mm-hmm. And I always wondered what kind of voicing they had. You said 10 inches?
Actually, the pressure ranged from about 5 inches to originally 25 inches for one of the reed stops. I think as it now stands, it's about 20 inches. But there are a multitude of pressures in the organ. So the blower had to produce a very high static pressure, which then was divided up among the various reservoirs within the organ. So it's a very complex winding system. And of course, now actually, there was some work done on it in the 2000s. Some of the reservoirs had been re-leathered, and that's why J.R. Daniels managed to play something on it, because before that, you probably couldn't have gotten a note out of it. So there was a little bit of work done.
Yeah, I can remember that it was like a big wind machine. When you turned the organ on, you really could hear a lot of wind. And I don't know if nobody's mentioned it yet, but Andrew Carnegie really must have loved the organ, because he gave organs in a number of different places, including the beautiful concert hall in where is it? Hazelwood, not Hazelwood.
Yes, and Homestead. Well,
Homestead. I meant to say Homestead. That is a beautiful hall, also.
Yeah.
So that organ is completely intact. John Calkins and Randy Wagner, who some of you might know from organ supply industries, and I documented that organ. And Randy's thought was, because of where it is and how it's installed, it could never be restored. But it's probably one of the only Vodi organs that is in existence. So historically, it's quite interesting, but I don't think you can ever do anything with it.
You mentioned Andrew Carnegie. I heard that people say that he gave church organs, but that's not quite true, that he gave a percentage. Has anybody heard that?
Well, actually,
I could plug for Jim. Jim did a wonderful article in the Tracker 7 years ago about the First Unitarians organ, the Philip Worshing organ there. And it's a great description that Jim wrote. And by the way, my hat's off to you, Jim. Your knowledge of the Carnegie Music Hall organ and the organs of the other halls is phenomenal. But it was a complex business of its own, supplying the organs, and that's true. There was a system of doing percentage later on. I mean, take that away from Jim, but it's an excellent article in the Tracker.
So, I mean, I've heard that, Carnegie maybe gave 50% of the total cost of an instrument. Is that accurate, or did he give the whole cost?
Actually, look, I'll clear that up in a minute, but what Frank is holding up there is an article I wrote many years ago. And it reminds me of the story of Bob Elmore, who recorded Bach on the Atlantic City organ one time. And somebody later, many years later, asked him about it. He said, "Oh, you have the other copy?" Well, it's like this. But anyway, what happened was Carnegie actually started in, I think it was 1873, but memory's going. His mother's church, the new church, the Church of New Jerusalem. Anyway, on the north side, he was asked to give an organ. He did, and after that, then he started getting more requests, and he gave organs. And this got a little out of hand. And by 1903, the requests were coming in so big that he decided he would make only matching grants. And from 1903 until he died, they were 50%. And Carnegie, being a control freak that he was, he would pay the organ builder his 50% only after the church paid theirs.
Another.
But that was most of the organs.
We should talk about another benefactor of organ gifts, and that was Mrs. Frick, who was the one who gave the organ in the Frick Rotunda. And you had talked about that earlier, Ken. But Bob Lord always used to talk about Helen Frick. He was, I think, a pretty close friend of hers, and she was responsible for putting the organ in the original organ in Heinz Chapel. And she put, I don't remember all the other churches where she gave organs, but she was very generous as well.
Oh, yeah, I heard that Andrew Carnegie made a remark that if people didn't appreciate the homilies, the sermons, they would at least be able to appreciate the organ music.
Yes, actually, that's
I suppose that comment, crosses all denominations.
Yes.
But,
actually, I think the quote was something to the effect, "The organ will speak more eloquently than the preacher."
we wouldn't challenge that, would we?
So,
Wow.
And said, yes, Andrew Carnegie did have a great love for organ music. He had an organ in his home in New York City on Fifth Avenue, another Cooper Hewitt, in Skibo, his castle in Scotland. And he would awaken to organ music at 8 o'clock every day. He would hire professional organists to play in his home. It's not uncommon at that time. Actually, one of his associates, his most important protege, Charles Schwab, who became the first head of U.S. Steel, was himself an organist and would play Carnegie's organ in his home on Fifth Avenue.
Well, that was like George Eastman in Rochester, who also loved organ music. And in the Eastman house there, he had this beautiful house organ. And that's how Harold Gleason was brought to Eastman, because he wanted to have him play. It went for breakfast, he wanted breakfast music on that organ.
Wow. Somebody's asking about the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra, and I don't remember much about their history, but I guess at one time they played in Oakland, and they moved to Heinz Hall. So when did they move to Heinz Hall?
Well, that was when John Heinz paid to have the, what's at Heinz Hall, what was at Heinz Hall before it was a movie theater. And they had, I guess they had an organ, and they had, when they had silent movies. And then they used to be in Oakland at the Syria Mosque. When we first moved to Pittsburgh, we used to go to the symphony in Oakland.
Oh, so it really was not the music hall, the Carnegie Hall.
No.
yeah, well,
Well, they were the music hall.
It's a
They started
history.
up there, then Syria Mosque. then downtown at the Heinz Hall.
Okay, yeah, I think the question was maybe asking if perhaps if they played regularly in the music hall, they would have had access to the organ. Would there be any chance that we did organ and orchestra?
The answer is probably yes, but I've never researched that. The history of the symphony orchestras here, I think, is quite interesting and probably should be written one of these days. As I pointed out in 1895, actually in 1896, the Pittsburgh Orchestra was formed. And that was a professional orchestra that lasted from then until 1910. In 1926, a bunch of theater musicians, pit orchestra players, decided to get together and form an orchestra, which is the current Pittsburgh Symphony. And because Sunday was their only day off, they could only play on Sundays. And therefore they could not play in the music hall. The Pittsburgh Orchestra played in the music hall. The Pittsburgh Symphony, when it was formed, could not play in the music hall because the music hall was booked for organ recitals. The whole thing. So they started in the Syria Mosque in 1926, and they stayed there until what, about 1972, when
Yes.
Jack Hines got the Penn Theater retreaded as a music hall.
Excellent. All right, well, I think it's time for us to sort of wrap it up. Any closing thoughts before we say goodnight for the evening? Are we convinced that this is an instrument that should be rebuilt, whatever, refurbished? Would there be an audience? What would it do for our city? Is that something that we need to?
Well, I started to say this, maybe I did say it, because the audiences for recitals are very small, and opening the doors of a major concert hall is expensive.
Mhm.
So that's a problem. But the universities here, CMU and Duquesne, could use the organ. They do use the hall.
Well, we use the hall for band concerts,
Yeah. So there are uses for it. And I still think, as I said earlier, I think it would be a drawing card for music students to Pittsburgh.
Definitely. Mhm.
Well, we have to kind of talk to all of our wealthy friends, see if they have some extra cash or sitting around. Sounds like a worthy project, something that our guild probably should keep on the back burner and keep your ears open just in case, even out in the community, people ask about the instrument. We could be the impetus for that project taking off someday. So in closing, I just want to thank Jim and Ann and Frank for a wonderful discussion, a wonderful program. We've learned a lot this evening. We have such wonderful musicians in our city. We have such a wonderful history. We have a wonderful guild. There is so much to celebrate. Thank you for helping us to celebrate that. Thanks again, and good night.
Good night, everyone.